G'day gamers, Aussie Wargamer here in Moree, Australia, and welcome to my channel. On this episode, I have a chat about what it is I like about tabletop gaming, and I show you a nice quick way to paint old distressed leather. So let's get to it, eh? People have been enjoying games in some form or another since people have existed, and we enjoy games for a multitude of reasons. Some people like the thrill of competition, others prefer the chill of cooperation. For me, there are three main reasons that I enjoy tabletop gaming, including war games, tabletop RPGs, and board games. Now, the first is strategy. This doesn't mean, of course, I'm a master strategist or anything, quite the contrary. In just about every game I play, my strategy is pretty basic. The thing I love, though, is making meaningful choices. And that's what I mean by strategy, making meaningful choices. I'm most satisfied when playing games if, in each turn I take, there are choices where each option has advantages and disadvantages. If there's a single clear thing I need to do in a turn, it takes away any agency I have, and the game is essentially playing itself. For example, in Warhammer Age of Sigmar, when you're deploying your army, you need to make a choice as to what units you'll put down first and where you want to put them. These choices influence your opponent and your own ability to effectively use your army. Likewise, when faced with a challenge in an RPG, I want my character to be able to do things that have a meaningful effect on the future of the story. I love strategy in that form of meaningful choices. I also really enjoy the social aspect of tabletop gaming. Our club meets every Tuesday, and I organise board game nights outside of this as often as I possibly can. Games are great for social interaction because you have a clear talking point, engaging interaction, and everyone participates in a shared story. The obvious example of this is in role-playing games, but I'm still talking about crazy things that happen in games of Warhammer or Mordheim from years ago. I was playing a game of Gaslands earlier this year, and my mate Rhett had a car with a death ray. It's kind of an all-or-nothing weapon. For it to go off, you need to roll a 6 and 2 5-ups on 3 dice, so it's super rare. But when it goes off, it one-shots another car. Anyway, me mate Lockie was about to win the race, but me mate Rhett had his death ray. And if it went off, Lockie loses, Rhett rumbles over the line. So he rolls the dice, there's a 6 and a 5, and the other dice had rolled under a tower. So everyone held their breath as the tower was lifted to reveal the 5 Rhett needed for the death ray to go off, and everyone cheered. It was a great moment, and it's those kind of social interactions that make tabletop games so much fun. Well, finally, a major part of my enjoyment of tabletop games is tactility and aesthetics. I love to be able to pick up the little pieces, to roll dice, move miniatures. I love the click of the tape measure, the feel of a hand of cards, the satisfaction of placing a tile down exactly where you want it to go. This is the one thing that you can get from tabletop games that video games won't really give you. And that pleasure, that tactile pleasure, is increased even more when the bits and bobbins in a game that you move around look great as well. I have a game, for example, called Everdell. It's a really nice little game where you have these cute little animal meeples and you get to place them on the board. There's fantastic artworks on the card, really nice resources that you can collect, including these little berries that are even a little bit squishy. And I get excited whenever I get to play a good-looking game like this where I can play around with all the little bits. I made this little Venn diagram here to show that tabletop games are really able to scratch the itch of all three things: strategic, social, and tactile elements in games. Well, I'd love to know why you play tabletop games. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to have a chat about it. In the meantime, here's a little tutorial on an easy way to paint old, distressed leather. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to paint some leather here on the tabard, and going to make it aged leather. So the whole thing with this guy, obviously, as I talked about a couple of videos ago, is that they've been stuck in Shadespire or whatever for so long that everything is decaying, their armor is starting to rust, and all their leather is beat up. So what we're going to do, well, first up, I'm just going to base coat it in this game color charred brown, which is essentially Rhinox hide in the Games Workshop range. So just going to give it a base coat here. But the idea is that I'm going to base coat it and then build up a bunch of texture with a lighter color, and then glaze over that texture and build up layers of texture and glaze to get a nice old leather feel. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to a much smaller brush. This is a Winsor & Newton Series 7 size 0. Normally I prefer using the bigger brushes, but what we want to do here is we want to use a little bit of Flow Aid. So what Flow Aid does is it helps to break the surface tension of the paint, and we're going to use a little bit of Flow Aid into some game color khaki, because we want it to be super thin. We want these lines to be really fine, and the problem with a bigger brush is that a lot of paint will come up here in the barrel, and I don't want a lot of paint. I only want a tiny little bit of paint, because when I push on the tip of the bigger brush, so much more paint that I want is going to come out. So we're using a finer brush, but because we're only using such a small amount of paint, we don't want it to dry out on our brush, and we want it to be nice and thin and flowing. So I'm just going to use some Flow Aid with the khaki on that, and I'm just painting very thin lines across the leather, trying to keep everything in random but roughly the same direction, and I am emphasizing the edges, but coming all the way through the middle, just tiny little lines across the dark brown here. And you can come in at a little bit of an angle from time to time. You can make some lines a little bit thicker, a little bit thinner, but we're just running those lines across that leather. And every now and then you might need to come back in. Sorry, I'll get that in. You might need to come back in with the charred brown, just to clean up some lines that you might have made a bit too thick or whatever. And you should have this nice series of texture. What I want to do now is I'm going to take some Army Painter Strong Tone, put a little bit on the brush, just wipe a bit off, paper towel, thumb, whatever it is, and we're going to glaze over that, and we're going to let that glaze fully dry before we go back in. Alright, so our glaze is dry now. So just going to come back in, a little bit of Flow Aid, a little bit of khaki on the small detail brush. And this time when I do my lines, I'm just going to focus on the edges and some, sorry, on the edges and some of the raised bits of this leather. So just thin lines, not pushing too hard, basically just like caressing the surface along the edge, tiny little strokes. It's all about control. Brace your elbows up against a desk or something. I like to have my elbows up on my desk and my hand locked up into the miniature holder clamp thing, whatever it's called, and just back and forth, tiny little lines of detail here. Just focusing on those edges. We don't want to run a full edge highlight because we want to keep it looking natural, and the best way of doing that is creating these creases. So when leather is worked a lot, it creates these creases, and obviously the edges of something is what's going to beat it up, is what's going to get beaten up the most, and so we're just focusing on those edges there. And then I'm going to throw down another 2 glazes with the strong tone. This time I'm going to mix a tiny bit of the charred brown or run oxide or whatever it is into that wash, just to make it a little bit heavier in the pigment. So just taking off a bunch of that paint and glazing over the top with that. Focusing on the middle but coming out to the edges as well. And we'll wait for that to dry. Okay, so that's dry now. So just going to come back one more time with the khaki, bit of flow aid on the thin brush. I'll just test it here on my thumb so I can make sure I'm getting the nice fine lines. And now we're just going in on the very edge, just tiny little strokes, trying to make them random, organic. And this will essentially act as an edge highlight without actually being an edge highlight. Alright, then I have some Army Painter Dark Tone, and again with my size 0 brush. I could probably do this with my size 5, but what I want to do is again essentially black line without black lining, and separate each of the little individual bits of leather here. Before I do that though, I just noticed I've got a big blob of khaki up the top, so I'm just going to break that up with some more charred brown like that. And then probably this will take a couple of coats of the black. Just dropping it in between each individual bit of leather. So I'll go back and do that a couple of times. Alright, so the very last thing I'm going to do now that I've blacklined it a little bit, and I picked out the rivets with Vallejo dark aluminium. I'm just going to hit it with some ultra matte varnish just to take away any gloss from the washers or anything like that. So just hit it, probably only need one coat of this, and we are done. I'll put a photo up at the end of the video, but that is how you can paint aged leather. Well, that's all I have for this episode. Let me know in the comments below why you play tabletop games and what you want to see in future episodes of the Aussie Wargamer. As always, thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want to hear more of my voice. Catch us later.